So here's the plan for the next 25 to 30 minutes. I will start with a very quick critical engagement with Levinas's ethics to show the promise of and also the concerns raised by the demand for infinite responsibility. In the second part of my talk, excuse me, my throat is giving up. It's not COVID. So okay, so in the second part of this talk, I will present some reflections and ideas elicited from experimental studies whose design draws on aspects of phenomenology and mindfulness. I will try to suggest that with the aid of such experiments, we can access moments of clarity which can help us to resolve at least some of the excesses or impasses in Levinas's ethics. So buckle up, here comes a lightning tour of Emmanuel Levinas and his thinking. So in his well-known phenomenological analysis of liminal experiences, such as nausea, insomnia, and fatigue, Levinas identifies the need to escape oneself as a common inherent trait of such experiences, locates this feeling of urgent need for escape in the relation between being and beings, more specifically in the way beings, tables, chairs, us, take up our existence within the flow of being. I quote, the need for escape leads us into the heart of philosophy. It allows us to renew the ancient problem of being qua being. So what is the structure of pure being? So Levinas suggests that the realm of pure being, that is existence in itself, is more or less like a pot of soup. It is, in its totality, existence is unique, it's full and complete. It has an internal flow, which is not to be thought of as the flow of time, but as the potential for existence, like us beings, to form and emerge within it. Beings then arise in being in instance of polarization or coagulations within the flow of being, which form and dissolve instantaneously. This instantiation of an existence within existence remains always an ongoing process, a repeated moment of birth. It's like coming and going continuously out of existence in every instant. For us humans especially, this is a difficult birth, because in every instant that the ego emerges into the flow of being, it continuously finds itself bound to its existence in what Levinas describes as an acute feeling of being held fast. This means that the condition of horror and the need to escape, which at first seem to refer specifically to experience of limit, such as trauma, insomnia, or fatigue, in fact turns out to be inscribed in the structure of existence itself. It's something that, according to Levinas, we feel in every instant of our being, that we are sort of bound and tied to ourselves. The ego tries to distance itself from its existence, from being, from this pure horror of pure being, by engaging with other beings in the world around it, trying to distract itself through pleasure, art, food, knowledge. But since anything the ego engages with lies within the realm of being, all its attempts to escape are futile. There is nowhere and nothing to escape to. I quote, pleasure is the process of departing from being, yet it is a deceptive escape, for it is an escape that fails, and this failure is underscored by shame. End of quote. So the only possibility of escape would be to a realm which takes the ego beyond being, beyond existence altogether. The alterity which we glimpse in the face of the other announces the possibility of such a way out of being, to the good beyond being. By making itself infinitely responsible for the other, the ego places the other in the place of itself and is thus released from its bond with itself. The ego is, as it were, pardoned of its existence. But for this escape to be possible, the relation with the other must remain beyond the realms of being. I quote, this relationship is not to be conceived as a bond with another ego, nor as a comprehension of the other which makes his alterity disappear. Such a relation can be maintained by making oneself infinitely responsible for the other to the extent that the other takes the place of the self. In exchange for this replacement, the ego is granted release from the self and is offered the possibility of a fresh start, a virginal instant. The ego thus acquires a future, it becomes temperate. Levinas borrows his narrative for the relation between the ego and the other from Plato's description of Eros, leading immortal souls over the realm of being, going out on this tour, sort of, over being, to catch a glimpse of the ungraspable good beyond being. However, although Levinas couches this relation within the language of Eros, it remains wholly attached to the asymmetry and fear which lie at the basis of this encounter. I quote, it is a fearful face-to-face situation of a relationship without intermediary, without mediations. The other is what I am not. He is the weak one, whereas I am the strong one. He is the poor one, the widow and the orphan. Or else the other is the stranger, the enemy, and the powerful one. So, although there is a promise and potential in this thinking, I think there is also room for concern. Sum up, this thinking promises the possibility of an immediate encounter with the other, in which, driven by unbound compassion, we give ourselves up for the other and are granted a fresh start, a future. But the conditions require that the ego is traumatized by its existence and sees no possibility for escape, or for relief or escape, and is desperate for pardon from its own existence. The relation also comes at a high price, basically that the ego gives up the self in an asymmetrical relationship based in fear of the other, who is utterly weak or all-powerful. What I am suggesting here is that in this relationship, the ego is practically coerced into handing itself over to the other in order to escape its bondage to a traumatic existence. The demand for infinite responsibility in such circumstances probably leaves such limited space for choice for the ego that one questions whether his actions can be attributed to or regarded as moral agency. In short, it seems that this excessive terror, coupled with its crushing ethical demand, blunts the promise of this thinking and brings it close to an ethics of hostages, hostage taking. So I will now move on to present some reflections from what I call experiential forays, which I undertook to try and seek some possibilities of repair for what I still feel is a very valuable and promising line of ethical thought. But first, I will clarify what I mean by experiments in experiential phenomenology, or sort of a term that I use very loosely. So this is a pick and choose methodology, something that I basically designed for my own purposes. It does not adhere strictly to scientific practice. It is not meditation or, strictly speaking, mindfulness practice, and it is not very close to classical or experimental phenomenology either. I borrow elements from all of these and just, in a way, pick and choose for my own purposes, for the purposes of my own present study. So these experiments have their roots in a practice-led research project which explored the theme of transgression and transcendence through catabasis, that is the theme of a journey of transformation that involves going into the underworld. The research experimented with the use of photography inside caves to explore how the play of light and shadow on cave walls is manifested in photographic images. The main source of inspiration for this study and the ensuing experiments was George Bataille's text Last Poem, Birth of Art, in which he explores the emergence of Homo sapiens, which, as he sees it, happens through the act of creating or giving birth to art in Paleolithic cave dwellings. Describing the technical challenges faced to produce the photographic plates which accompanied Bataille's text, very, very beautiful text. The series editor, Albert Spira, describes how, I quote, each time having developed our plates and checked the results, we decided to make a fresh start, for what the eye sees is not necessarily what the camera captures. End of quote. In the case of our own research, the objective of the photographic experimentation went in somewhat of an opposite direction. In our case, we actually wanted to allow the lighting and the camera, through the images they revealed, to set free what the eyes, in a way, refused to see. So here are some examples of the results of these experiments. These images highlighted how the cave environment, by the way it pushes our technology as well as our perceptual capabilities, seems to have a corrosive and at the same time liberating effect on accepted borders, such as those between the human and the animal, the self and the other, and even the human and the cave itself. It seems like, in a way, we start melting into the cave and being transformed by its contours and also with sounds and its reflections. Consequently, these results highlighted the potentials for these phenomenological forays, which I then went on to explore further within other cavernous environments. So what I seek in these forays is an access to what Maurice Blanchot, in his review of Bataille's text, calls, I quote, an intimate space of knowledge, feeling of presence, of clear burning presence. I also chose what I call cave forays as experiences of limit because of the many parallels between Levinas's description of moments of limit and Bataille's claims about the process of emergence of early humans from the pre-human state. I hoped that within this intimate space of knowledge, I would be granted a better understanding of our relation with existence, which is at the foundation of Levinas's ethics, as I was trying to show the first part of this presentation. So generally, these experiments consisted in entering a cave, settling down in a spot which is as close to complete darkness as possible. I then try to focus on the immediate experience of the cave environment and also pay particular attention to my vision, hearing, all the senses, basically. How they are modified by the conditions and in and around the cave. So this is a drawing by Anthony Catania. It's an artist's interpretation of one such experience of perceptual modification inside the cave. I will give two brief examples of notes taken in such forays and consequent analysis of these notes. So this is, I mean, when Christos talked about work in progress as the sort of objective for these seminars or these presentations, this is really work in progress. I mean, it's probably pre-work in progress if there's any such thing. So the message is, you know, this is scary. I'm sticking my neck out, so go easy on me. So first, the notes. This is what I sort of take to be my what I consider as my primary data. These are notes that I write during these forays. So vision returns gradually. Many dark recesses remain. I try to guess what is in the dark gaps. I realize that I have a rough mental sketch of the cave. An area which I thought was a recess now emerges as a rock face. I make adjustments to my mental sketch, more differences and mismatches. I get the feeling that the contours of the cave may be changing. I decide to play along with my imagination. I can almost feel that the cave is breathing and its walls are closing in on me. So sort of then I go on to like attempt a short analysis of these notes after the fact also. And this is sort of an excerpt of my analysis, just to give you an idea of how I try to place or play in a way with these experiments. So the analysis goes something like this. This impression that the contours of the cave seems to shift is a recurring experience, one I get in different forays. It seems to support Levinas's claim that existence can take on the feeling of confinement and restriction. This feeling can sometimes be strong enough to compel one to sort of give oneself up, sort of, I can't take this anymore. I need escape. On the other hand, it is also possible to play along and tame this urge by turning it into a sort of game of the imagination. Another insight on the same notes is on the effect of darkness, in that darkness can take on a physical weight, often also embodied in the way one sits slightly crouched, as though one is carrying a heavy load. You find yourself sort of sitting down crouched in a cave when you don't really need to, sort of there is space to sit up straight and feel in a way better. It almost feels like one tries to make oneself smaller, or maybe in a Levinasian sense, is trying to escape or slip out of being or of existence. I repeat, experiments in different locations, sometimes alone, on others accompanied, seeking insights on how the world is given in and through these caves, as I've already described. So for the second example, these are some excerpts from notes taken at the Cueva de los Manos in Chile. So these are my notes, sort of my primary data. Total silence, wind died down suddenly, complete darkness, blinding stars within reach. Extreme contrasts, howling wind to stillness, darkness and stars, deep sleep, repeated wake-ups, dawn, relief, joy, and terror. So later on, I was sort of thinking and trying to analyze these notes and trying to recall the feeling of presence, sort of, that I had inside this cave. So extremes during this experience brought about a feeling of the world dissolving. The complete darkness and stillness gave the feeling that I was disappearing along with the world. Playing along with this thought, the absence of perceptual input can be experienced as though one is drowning in some invisible substance which blocks all sounds, or maybe melting back into the anonymous flow of being. Again, recalling Levinas. Waking up repeatedly but sleeping very soundly in intervals gave the feeling that during deep sleep one is aware that one is resting. And waking up can be a disappointment. Sort of like, oh, what a shame, I lost it. It felt so good. I was really, really in deep sleep and I was sort of recovering. And this can give the feeling of finding oneself bound again or recaptured by being, sort of this disappointment of waking up or being caught. On the other hand, however, it can also give a feeling of joy, of accomplishment, that one really managed to sleep well, even though very often in difficult or uncomfortable conditions. At one point, I stood outside the cave with my hand outstretched to balance on the wall, sort of, it was a cliff, and I just got out and I realized I was holding onto the wall, and I suspect that I placed my hand on or close to one of the handprints. A feeling of shock or horror, but also, I must admit, a feeling of deep joy, great joy, almost like a sudden connection. So joy and terror can be experienced in combination, feeding on and nourishing each other. So I think this element of joy is largely missing in Levinas's ethics. I think there are variations or modes in the way we experience being. There is both terror and joy, and Levinas's ethics may probably benefit from a more balanced approach, which would include elements of both. So to conclude this section on caves, I don't claim that there is anything which is particularly original or surprising in these reflections, but what I hope to show is that these experiential forays can grant access to an immediacy of phenomena, which gives these phenomena a different dimension altogether, a dimension of heightened clarity. It is in this same presence and clarity that I now seek insights regarding compassion and the ethical response to the other through experiences or forays in the practice of walking meditation. So, Firstly, what draws me to walking meditation? Basically, its claim or promise to empower compassion and the sense of well-being, its focus on the moment and on engaging mindfully on immediate experiential content, which have a lot of in common with phenomenology, and that its origins in non-Western culture may present new perspectives or new possibilities for our ethical thought. My practice of walking meditation is based mainly on the text of Natha, and I want to make clear that I am not a trained practitioner of mindfulness or of walking meditation. I am not advocating that walking meditation can solve the world's problems or anyone's problems for that matter. What I want to highlight is these, again, as I said, points of clarity that my own walks revealed regarding my specific research interests. So starting with what is actually walking meditation, words of Thich Nhat Hanh, it is simple and easy, at least on the face of it. So all there is to it is first thing to do is to lift your foot, breathe in, put your foot down in front of you, first your heel, then your toes, breathe out, feel your feet solid on the earth, and you have arrived. End of quote. So walking meditation should not be difficult or challenging. If you let your breathing guide you, and this is the key, you can find a comfortable rhythm between your breathing and your walking so that your breathing remains natural and comfortable. And it's also important, I think a key in walking meditation is to be grateful for every step. It is important to be mindful of the contact of your foot on the ground, to relish that contact, actually feel the ground, make a journey of every step. In every step, you have arrived. So when you are fully in the present moment, the here and now, you are in the only place that you can really exist. Now there seems to be an opposite movement in direction with regards to the relation to the moment when we compare Levinas and mindful walking. So while in Levinas, there is a movement away from the moment, an escape from the self towards a future of possibility, in mindfulness, there is a movement, an opposite movement, it seems, towards the moment, to recenter the self, which has been trapped away of itself in its past and its future. So the main questions with which I set off on my walking meditations were one. Okay. Maybe okay. The main questions were one: can this resolution offer possibilities for an ethics of infinite responsibility? And can meditation, can this resolution offer possibilities for an ethics of infinite responsibility? And can walking meditation enlighten us on an adequate ethical response to the other? So I will now present, very fast and very briefly, some points of clarity revealed along two forays, which I undertook during the past 6 months trekking in the Himalayas. I consider the following excerpts from my notes as my primary data because, well, as I tried to show before, they are thoughts which I found repeating to myself along my breathing and my walking. It's like these words sort of accompanied me in some way. So these are some of the thoughts that accompanied me on my walking. So listening to my breath, listening to my steps, I am constantly distracted by the voices in my head. So very often in the beginning of the day, I find myself, my head is full of random thoughts, distract my focus, and I realize that if I am to be able to respond to the other, I have to first of all be able to listen to the other. And obviously these thoughts distract or inhibit that possibility of listening. So it seems that clearing the head, being at peace, would be the first condition for an adequate response to the other. Yeah. Escaping the voices that kept dragging me out of the moment turned out to be the biggest challenge. And this really kept reminding me of Levinas's continuous moment of bondage of the ego to the self. So one of the prominent questions leading my meditations was often, how is one to escape and where to? So again, setting out with this question in my head, these words sort of fell in rhythm with my thoughts, if you like, and with my stepping, and they accompany me. So hear your breath, listen, taste your breath, look, hear your step, listen, feel your step, look. Reflecting on my primary data, I realized that the focus on my breathing really brings me to my now. And the focus on my stepping really brings me here. I am necessarily always breathing now and always breathing here. I have no choice. This focus slowly raises my awareness of where I am, what is around me, and also gives me some idea of who I am at that moment. And without noticing, all the other clutter starts slowly disappearing. It is like this focus brings me home to myself. So just one last thing about, and then that's it. In stillness, hearing now can listen to the voice that is closest, engage. At times, it became possible to listen to and to engage fully with that which is most important, and to look at an issue from a distance and from different perspectives, but with a strong sense of presence and focus. A really direct and immediate experience of whatever issue or thought one is engaging in. But at the same time, this presence is experienced as something beyond the self, almost as if beyond me. Almost as if a self beyond me is engaging with a problem or an issue which is also beyond me and beyond sort of my previously personal issue, in a way. So release, the moment is over, let it drift away, the work is done. Reflecting on this, I realized how I often felt that at some point an engagement with a pressing thought slowly faded or drifted away. This feeling, this feels like the work is done or its moment has passed. It feels like the problem has given me permission to release it, to let it drift away. And in turn, I also feel released. So to conclude, so what do we take from all this? This sort of jumble of very subjective thoughts. How can it help research project on trying to repair, something as complicated and elaborate as Levinas thinking of the other? What you can say. So what can we say that these forays in walking meditation reveal regarding the possibility of an ethical engagement with the other? I think that there are a number of points in these insights that can be used to inform a less oppressive ethical engagement than the one proposed by Levinas. So by way of concluding, I will propose some of these points. So meeting the other, so I think that sort of these insights gave me or brought me up to a presence where I saw the possibility of meeting the other unencumbered by my own needs. I think the focus during walking meditation makes this possible, that it opens up the possibility of an engagement which is completely in the moment, shedding off all preconceptions and preconditions. The other is encountered in the moment. There is an immediate recognition of the humanity in the gaze of the other, an unmediated encounter, disconnected and unencumbered by baggage from the past or preoccupations with the future. A recognition which is mutual, leaving both the self and the other free to engage or walk away if they like. This is a freedom which empowers infinite responsibility and nurtures the will for offering such a response. I think that an engagement with the other, I'll just do this because, well, see, this is how technology takes the upper hand. I think that an engagement with the other that fully witnesses the other's humanity will involve both the terror of witnessing the human condition in the other and also therefore reflected in myself, with all its contradictions, its failings and vulnerabilities, but also the joy of connecting directly with the other, a joy which is particularly deep and uplifting when this engagement and mutual recognition bridges the gap between individuals belonging to radically different cultures. I think that an unmediated awareness of this tension between joy and terror at the basis of the human condition has the potential to empower and enrich an engagement with the other that can be truly effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive Zammit. And we now have Francesca Brencio. Do you have a PowerPoint? You have a PowerPoint. Also, the recording. Do you see it somewhere? PowerPoint?
No, I think here. But open. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe here.
Perhaps it's this one.
Yeah.
2022. No, the other one. Cyprus presentation. Thank you.
And to share screen.
Yes, and also to
Yeah,
enlarge.
yeah.
And then I have to swip.
Yes, or you can use
No,
the.
I prefer to swip.
Okay.
If it's possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
We do the
Slideshow.
Begin. Here we do screen sharing.
Okay.
Is it this one?
It is this one, I think. Yes. And then I have to swip.
Yeah.
Is it right?
Yeah.
Yes, is it right? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the floor is yours. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank Christos and all his team, Susie Ferravello, University of Cyprus, and all the partner organizations involved in this event for such a wonderful conference. The talk I'm going to present today moves around the notion of Galasanite, which, as many of you know, is the title of a couple of works of Martin Heidegger. I'm referring to two Erörterungen der Gelassenheit aus einem Feedback-Gespräch über das Denken, written between 1944 and 45, published in volume 13 of Gesamtausgabe, translated as Conversation on a Country Path about Thinking, and Gelassenheit, strictly speaking, written in 1955 and published in volume 16 of Gesamtausgabe, translated as Discourse on Thinking. Of course, the word Gelassenheit, understood as releasement or serenity, is used by Heidegger also in other places of his collective work. And here you can have just a page. What I would like to do today is to show how Heidegger post-war meditation, and in particular his meditation on Gelassenheit, may be regarded as a form of embodied experience of practicing phenomenology that shape our thinking and the possibility of living in the original openness of the being. In doing so, I've divided my presentation into two main sessions. In the first one, I will recapitulate Heidegger's most important phases of his meditation on the issue of being to show how Galasanite enters into his meditation. And in the second section, I will discuss what Heidegger means with Besinnung and how this notion is related to Gelassenheit, understood as an embodied experience of practicing the phenomenology, both conceived under the light of his critique toward technology and machination as the most eye-catching elements of Western metaphysics. My goal is to put in relation the notion of Besinnung and Gelassenheit to show how the late meditation of Heidegger's inaugurates the displacement of subjectivity at the borders of ontology, a movement from an ego-logical perspective into an ecological one. Along the presentation, I will try to use the original German words. I apologize for this, in order to avoid any confusion between Heidegger's work entitled Besinnung and translated in English as mindfulness, and mindfulness, properly speaking, understood as the practice and technique of bringing one's attention into the present moment. The English translation of Martin Heidegger's work, Besinnung, is mindfulness. Besinnung is an inquiry into the self-disclosure of being that in being time Heidegger calls the meaning or design of being, and that from a contribution to philosophy and words he calls the truth of being. The volume, Besinnung, is one of the 7 major ontological treatises composed by the author between 1936 and 1942, and is a turning point in his pathway toward the question of being. Here, Heidegger elaborates in detail many themes and hints laid down in the contribution to philosophy, insisting on the historically self-showing of the being and underlying in the fundamental hermeneutic and phenomenological perspective that experiences, thought, and project open for the truth of being as, in a way, I would say, as event. What are these 7 major ontological treatises on the history of being? Well, I will not mention them at all. You can see here listed. But the question is, why did Heidegger write these 7 major ontological treatises? In this period, Heidegger seeks to understand the issue of being from a non-representational apophantic perspective. In other words, the issue of being is understood as truth of being in terms of the experience of its own historical enactment. Being historical thinking becomes what it is from within a transformation of fundamental ontological thinking, and not by turning away from the first pathway of the question of being. It is Heidegger himself who, in the contribution in the Beiträge, addresses the relationship between the second pathway of elaboration, the question of being, which he takes in contributions, and the fundamental ontological pathway, which he takes in being time. A fundamental change occurs in Heidegger thinking from 1936 to 1946. A change which can be observed through the pathway from contributions to philosophy to Galasanite, and that shows a different understanding of the Seinsfrage and moreover of the attunement of Heidegger's thinking. Recapitulating the long and difficult trajectory of Heidegger's meditation on the issue of being, it is not easy. If we would summarize how the issue of being enters into his meditation, we could say that it comes from a double track, from a logical one and from a phenomenological one. They find their point of the encounter into the living being in its historical movement, as Heidegger's early writing shows. In his letter dated March 5, 1916 to his fiancée, Wilfriede Petri, he writes, "Today, I know that a philosophy of living life is possible. that I must declare war on rationalism right through the bitter end, without falling victim to the anathema of unscientific thought. I can, I must, and so today of necessity I face the problem. How can philosophy as living truth be enacted as a valuable and powerful creation of the personality? The possibility of the elaboration of a philosophy of living life discloses the distinction between the theoretical life of knowledge and the pre-theoretical life in which we already live before taking up the attitude of theoretical knowledge. Between 1919 and 1922, Heidegger suggests that phenomenology might not necessarily be tied to the concept of the transcendental. Satisfied with the reflective account of phenomenology, his efforts are aimed at defining a concept of practical life. Practicity stands for the naked fact of existence. This is possible by acknowledging the fundamental role of affective elements conceived both in active and passive aspects of intentional directness. The unity of intentional life must be searched for at the theoretical level, namely the pathic dimension of existence. The hermeneutic phenomenology of practical life scrutinizes the theoretical domain of each lived experience, stressing the role of the pathic dimension of the given. Far from falling into a kind of irrationalism, Heidegger insists on the foundational role of the theoretical dimension of life, which unveils the role of moods as means of accessing the world. In phenomenology of religious life, moods are often called affections, recalling the Latin word affectionis. Welcoming the legacy of Aristotle's meditation on affect, Heidegger stresses how a human being is constitutively a being in, because determined by the pather. And here we read, these pather affects are not states pertaining to absolute things, but are concerned with the disposition of living things in the world and the mode of being positioned towards something, allowing another to matter to it. The affect plays a fundamental role in the determination of being in the world, of being with and for others. Being in a mood indicates a situatedness and a disposition toward the world, the others, and language. This concept, announced between the Freiburg and Marburg years, became developed in a systematic way in beyond time, where Heidegger introduced the fundamental structure of Befindlichkeit as an a priori constitutive part of the science of practicity, shaping his understanding of intersubjectivity. The ontological issue becomes an hermeneutics of practicity. It is in the new approach that Heidegger focuses how the categories typical of practical being and the categories typical of every being are inscribed into the only issue, that is, the issue of being. That means the issues of being's categories and meaning. The point that Heidegger reached with Beyond Time and with the Freiburg courses till 1929 is that the being is historical in its essence. It is in the 1930s when the ontological existential analysis of Dasein is abandoned in favor of the being historical thinking, and the Seinsfrage is now investigated according to the ontohistorical movement of the being itself. It is with the conference entitled The Essence of Truth 1930 that inaugurates this new pathway of the same thinking, even if a significant point of foundation will be reached through the contribution to philosophy. The question of being and its oblivion, the forgetfulness of the ontological difference along the history of work of Western metaphysics and its consequences in modernity, the limits of philosophical language as an outcome of metaphysical thinking nourished the need of overcoming the Western code and sustained the possibility of shaping a new beginning and a new thinking in philosophy. These movements of thought were exemplified by the motto that Heidegger put at the very beginning of his collected works: Wege, nicht Werke, pathways, not works. If we go through the appendix of Besinnung, we can read. Since the spring of 1932, the plan has been firmly established in its main features, and it achieves its first shaping in the project opening called From Knowing. Everything moves toward this project opening, including eine heißende Sitzung mit Sein und Zeit, which also belongs to the domain of this mindful elaboration. The knowing historical thinking originates from within the fundamental ontological thinking of the question of being. This change of perspective to the question of being is widely known as die Kehre, the reversal. The thinking of the reversal is a change in my thought, but this same change is not a consequence of altering the scanned form, much less of an abandoning the fundamental issue of being time. The reversal is, above all, not an operation of interrogative thought. It is inherent in the very mother designated by the headings being time, time and being. As a result, even the initial steps of the question of the being question in being time thought is called upon to undergo a change. This movement corresponds with the reversal. And yet the basic question of being time is not in any sense abandoned by reason of the reversal. The question of being time is decisively fulfilled in the thinking of the reversal. Following this indication, we can understand why the truth of being as being historical thinking indicates that being's essential way is grasped historically. Being historically thinking is the thinking of the truth of being. It is precisely in this very long and difficult journey that we meet Besinnung. What is Besinnung, the book? Besinnung is divided in 28 parts and 135 sections. The manuscript Besinnung was composed in the year 1938-39, following the Weltweite philosophy. Besides, the manuscript was a typescript which Heidegger's brother, Fritz Heidegger, had already prepared and finished, typing right after the manuscript was completed in 39. In addition to the original German text of Besinnung, the edition edited by von Hermann includes an appendix which presents two allied significant and revealing texts. In the first one, Heidegger thinks over the development of his thought from the PhD dissertation of 1913 to the completion of the contribution of philosophy in 36-38. And the second text is service, is the unpublished works. By dividing them into 7 parts, gives a number of instructions concerning their future publication, reflects on his life path, and addresses his relationship with Christianity. Heidegger refers to these themes of this work as listing of lips. He wanted this work to be understood not as a system, not as a doctrine, not as a series of aphorisms, but as a series of short and long leaps of inquiry into the preparedness of the knowing of being. What is utmost significance of the work entitled Besinnung is that philosophy as mindfulness unfolds this inquiry. This inquiry is not merely a human enterprise of reflecting on the data of consciousness, on the peculiarity of perception, or on the states of mind. The inquiry explored with Besinnung is not entirely in a human description. What distinguishes this inquiry as Besinnung is that it is basically determined and shaped by the truth of being. Besinnung is not a reflection, not an outcome of Western metaphysical thinking, rather the contrary. Metaphysics removes itself from mindfulness of the truth of the being. As such, Besinnung cannot grasp the self, for example, as any other reflection in the domain of psychology and psychiatry may achieve, The self, which is inquired by Besinnung, is not an objectification. Heidegger asks whether through Besinnung the self is accessible to reflection. He says, Besinnung is so originary that it above all asks how the self is to be grounded. Thus, it is questionable whether through reflection on ourself we ever find ourself. While Heidegger endorses the grounding of the self via mindfulness on the self, at the same time he questions the very possibility of accessibility of the self to reflection. Dasein means taking over the distress of the grounding of the truth of being. It is the beginning of a history that has no history. From the perspective of thinking, mindfulness means preparing the preparedness for such a takeover in the form of knowing awareness of the being, because thinking inquiries into the truth of being is imageless saying of the word. Coming from the becoming of metaphysics, mindfulness must nevertheless touch upon the here too and cannot become inflexible as the finished product of a usable presentation, either in a doctrine or in a system or an exhortation or edification. Heidegger's understanding of mindfulness is in line, firstly, with his critique of metaphysics, and secondly, of science and technology, culminating in the critique of machination, which occupies his meditation from the end of the 40s. From this period onwards, he begins to be deeply committed in thinking and writing about the essence of technology as a way of revealing through its forgetfulness of being nihilist angestellt. The essence of technologies is connected to the Markenschaft, the machination, that occupies a large part of his reflection, both in the contribution to philosophy and within the Überlegungen and enactment. Progress, technology, machination are addressed from a metaphysical point of view and are considered as cardinal feature of modernity, since they do not only conceal the unfolding of the utmost of being, but restrict the human being into the darkest night. In his speech entitled The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger says, technology is the fool no mere means. Technology is a way of revealing. There is the possibility of all productive manufacturing, human being included. As we can read in Besinnung, the final rise of metaphysics is the history of the unconditioned predominance of the machination. Through mindfulness, understood as an inquirer and musing, man enters the truth of being, and thus takes man himself onto the fundamental transformation that arises out of this truth. The expectancy of Dasein, mindfulness means at the same time becoming free from the freedom of the subject, from the self-entangled dehumanization of man. Mindfulness means overcoming reason, be it as a mere receiving of what is forgiven, or be it as a planning and security. Besinnung is a leap into the origin, into the upper so that beings as such may be preserved and forgotten. Besinnung is the only possibility philosophy has to ground the truth of being. And as stated in Contribution to Philosophy, the necessity of philosophy as meditation consists in the fact that it must not do away with that pride, but must instead withstand it, ground it, and make it the ground of the history of mankind. Following this remarks, perhaps now we can understand why Heidegger insists on Galasanite as a way of being into the openness. The word Galasanite as the nominal form of the perfect participle of lassen, to let, as a long history in German code. Coined by Master Eckhart in the 13th century, it was used by a number of other mystics and theologians and philosophers, such as Jacob Böhm and Schilling. In the context of Christianity, Gelassenheit is generally thought to entail both a releasement from self-will and a releasement to the will of God. It is extremely possible that Heidegger draws on this tradition, but he also seeks to distance his thought from any God or divine will. His use of this word is not meant to simply reverse the dominant position in the field of theology and religious studies, namely from active assertion to passive deference. Rather, Heidegger inscribes Gelassenheit into the domain of non-willing, nicht wollen. His meditation seeks to free the meaning of this word from the dichotomy between activity and passivity. Of course, this enterprise is not easy, since it calls into question the very notion of will and all its modification. The movement from willing to non-willing is a significant transition which unveils the presence of Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power and of technological will to will. The meditations on Gelassenheit in terms of non-willing play a pivotal role in a turn in Heidegger's thought path itself, a turn which involves a transition from an ambiguous and often ambivalent philosophy of will to a radical and explicit critique of the will, together with an endeavor to think non-willingly. Counterpart Conversations was written precisely as Heidegger was rounding the bend of this second turn of this thought path. Beyond Gelassenheit, there are at least two big themes that Heidegger seeks to address. On one hand, the topology of being, for which the truth of being is elucidated by the place of being, and on the other hand, the critique of will, conceived as a transcendental representational region of the being. Gelassenheit aims to deal with these two issues and to unveil that the deepest meaning of being is letting. In other words, in Gelassenheit, human being properly corresponds to the Seinslassen of the being itself. Now, why and how can Gelassenheit be conceived as an embodied experience of practicing phenomenology? Are we dealing with the mere phenomenality? Are we exchanging the very basic elements of phenomenology for something else? My answer is no. An Heideggerian account of phenomenology provides the tools to scrutinize the experience of Gelassenheit as an embodied phenomenological experience. Gelassenheit is a tentative word for the essence of thinking, understood as a restful or passive waiting, where we leave open that for which we are waiting. The antristic of metaphysics requires a shift from an objective position will to Gelassenheit. Such releasement, Heidegger says, is something like rest. Gelassenheit is not a state, rather an ongoing experience which moves around the experience of meditation, renunciation, and non-will. This renunciation is not a form of passivity, rather a higher activity than that found in all the doings of the world and in all the machination of the realm of mankind. Gelassenheit is not merely attachment, rather is a releasement toward and from, as the human beings in their innermost essence belong to the open region of the being. Gelassenheit moves towards the things themselves. It is a tentative word for philosophy. In Besinnung we read, to philosophy belongs the serenity of the mastery of a measureless knowing awareness. Gelassenheit is a way of enduring the technological world and a way of dwelling into the world. For Heidegger, the modern and scientific thinking is characterized as a willful representation, which can be traced back to the Greek word of techne. However, to make things clear, there is a striking example about what releasement means in Heidegger. This example is offered by the poem of Angelus Silesius, which occupies a fundamental role in the work entitled The Principle of Living. And there we can read, the rose is without wild. It blooms because it blooms. It pays no attention to itself. as to know whether it is seen. The blooming of the rose is not something the rose is searching. It happens without a why. The rose pays no attention to itself, never to the world around. The rose rises into the openness of being without opposing this event. The rose is not merely an element of the natural world. The roses is a part of the fuses, which is another word for being in Heidegger lexicon. The rose blooms in the poem of the poet and only there. But this blooming is not simply what is said afterwards about so-called a real thing, a being. Instead, it alone, the blooming, is the being. That is why, according to the uniqueness and rareness of being, inventing, poetizing happens rarely. The blooming of the rose addresses the being of the rose. Through the event of appropriation, the blooming of the rose, we deal the most significant form of dying laughter. Humans live so differently from the rose that as they go about doing things in their world, they glance sidelong at that the world makes and requires of them. But even where such sidelong glancing is absent, we humans cannot come to be who we are without attending to the world that determines us as attending, to which we at the same time attend to ourselves. The rose has no need of this. The rose is abigail of this fundamental teaching, and the rose teaches us the displacement. What is this displacement? I'm going to conclude quickly. It is Heidegger himself who says something about the displacement of subjectivity. And it does precisely in the work entitled The Work of Art. To submit the displacement means to transform all familiar relations to word and to heard, and henceforth to restrain all usual doing and prizing, knowing and looking, in order to dwell within the truth that is happening in the world. Galasanite has to do with the blooming of the rose, but this is something we are not capable of. But as soon as we are capable of this, namely of letting something be in that unto which it is led, then we are truly free. Freedom rests in being able to let, lassen können, not in ordering and dominating. Against the appropriation of the word through technology, against machination and calculation, stand the rose and its blooming. Yet releasement toward things and openness to the mystery never happen of themselves. They do not befall us accidentally, but flourish only through persistent, courageous thinking. If releasement toward things and openness to the mystery awaken with us, then we should arrive at a path that will lead to a new ground and foundation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesca. You want to say here?
I think we have also another guest discussion.
Yes, of course. I'm really sorry. We have questions for both speakers, and I think it's best if you come here because also of the microphone. And we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay, so first we have Mahon O'Brien asking a question. Because yeah.
So this is more just so you could explain the way you thank you for the correct Davis. Sorry. In a way, a little bit like Michael Zimmerman was in Resolute Movement Galasanite. And I wonder what you thought about that, because I think you can have, personally, I think you can have Davis' argument without having to juxtapose it with Galasanite. Sense of which, what are you being called to resolve to being in time? Well, you resolve to submit what, become what you already are. and then Heidegger clarifies. No, I'm talking about the result there. I'm talking all willing is the letting. Language. Letting. So I just wondered what your take on that, the relationship between Gelassenheit and Galasanite, or whether you think
They're not divided. They are cases of listening. I do agree with you when you say cannot divide it, despite the many turnings, because there is not only one kere, there are many turnings. I think that here we are walking as a phenomenological practice into Heidegger's meditation. And this working is part of the Time and the Gelassenheit are tied together. So I very much appreciate Brett Davis' indication of will and of the issue of how Heidegger tried to overcome the issue of will, which is the theme was explored in a very masterful way by Hannah Arendt in The Life of the Mind. And I appreciate it very much is Brett Davis' reading of the will of Problem of Will and Heidegger. But I think the two goes together. We cannot separate it. Absolutely not. Sorry for the brevity of my answer, but there is also Clive. I don't want to steal time.
So there's a question from Pierrick Simon to Clive. The question is, thank you both for those interesting talks. For Clive Zammit, do you see joy and terror as two distinct feelings you experience, or as one singular experience of shock, for lack of a better word, which can be interpreted in different ways moving forward?
Yes, no, I think in a way they are joined. I think they nourish each other. I think wherever there's joy, there is an element of terror, and at least this is how I experienced it. Just to think of practical examples, like joy and terror come when you sort of get this feeling that the example of caves are sort of closing in on you, and sort of like the wall, the classic sort of movie scene where the walls are closing in, and there is even there's an element of joy in the sense that it's like a horror movie in a way. You enjoy putting yourself in that terror, and obviously, I mean, this would be unfair in the sense if one would like put this in the Levinasian context, because I am playing around, compared to Levinas's own experiences of real terror and hard labor and imprisonment. There is an element of joy and terror mixed in my experiences, because I'm putting myself in these experiences and I can get out wherever I like. But there is also an element where you can't get out, and I think that is where you actually, I think in this really space of clear presence, you really connect with the other. And there, I think joy and terror are connected, and they're mixed in recognizing, really cutting through everything and recognizing the witnessing really the humanity in the other's eyes, especially when the other is in a place of desperation, or is really at the end of it, basically. And there is joy and terror because you recognize your own humanity in that, and there is an element of joy because in that space there is a feeling that even at the very end, you are actually reaching and somehow touching that being that is at the very end. So, cut a long story short, I think that at least in my experience, they're always experienced together and also nourishing each other.
Okay, I have a question, unless there's Christos, then I'll follow you.
Thank you both for your papers. And guys, I don't know if you know, but Rilke has a poem for the walk, and he describes how when you walk, you see things without grasping them. As I can lay my eyes on the sunny hills, and we are grasped by something that is not grasped. And I was also thinking, perhaps, Francesca, you might want to cover this if that's all relevant. I was thinking about walking because I've been thinking about pilgrimage. Pilgrimages are Christian pilgrimages. And they have this quality that they are about the present moment and the walking. But there's also a kind of like destination to be reached. And the destination is as important, but it's not the most important. And Francesca, you talked about the kind of like Christian letting go of the will, but also surrender, maybe not surrendering, you didn't say surrender, appeasing God or like bringing a deferral. So I guess my question has to do about this combination of like destination and journey, the Heideggerian thinking, but also
just a tiny consideration. I do believe that in Heideggerian sense, walking is a training, a phenomenological training. It's not a case that everything concerning Heidegger productions has to do with the forestry and the walking. Ortswege, Unterwechsel zur Sprache, the very motto at the beginning of the collected work, it has to do with walking. And somehow it's a kind of being toward a certain point, but absolutely not. Don't put in the middle God and Christianity. He has a very bad relationship with Christianity, and but yes, not with God, not with the divine, not with the holy, but with the Christian, with the Christendom, with the political, historical phenomenon of Christianity. So, but yes, this is the way. This is the practice of walking.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, in my case, putting aside, all the implications of destination and destiny and all this, the idea of making really every step a journey in itself, I think is essential in walking meditation. And of course, every walk, and even in my walks, there was a destination, like a set route. But I think that one walks with in a way the humility that knowing that every step can be the last step. So especially when walking over mountains, that at any point you can feel very unwell, and you have to say, this is the end. I'm going to turn back, and I can't go further. And even to the very end, even when you're, or especially when you're sometimes very close to a mountain pass, so at the very top of a mountain, within eyesight, you can see the pass, like, maybe 30 meters away. Those 30 meters at 6,000 feet, 6,000 meters altitude can be like 30 kilometers, and you have to remain ready, even the last step that the mountain is going to block the way. So in that case, even if that happens, you have done your journey. The journey is done, and you have to be ready to let it go. It's not your journey, it's the step journey.
I have a question to Francesca. I think you did it. I think what you did there to juxtapose the Besinnung with reflective awareness. I think it's if I got you right, it is very productive. Contrasted the two. Would that be an accurate description of what you did?
I have problems with the English translation of Besinnung as mindfulness because of the use which they have of mindfulness. This is my problem.
Right.
Personally. So Besinnung, to me, is extremely problematic to be translated as mindfulness because it has too many echoes with the practice of mindfulness. Right. So the Besinnung, it has something which overcome the dichotomy of thinking.
Right.
So if we consider reflection as a process in which we have a subject and an object, yes, Besinnung is against this practice of reflection. That is an inherent movement of thought, an inherent movement of philosophy. But mindfulness, the English translation to me, makes some problems.
I would like to have Mahon's opinion maybe on this later because, but I'm not trying to pull you in the conversation now. But
And so I agree. I think you can. I think you can do both of them. Heidegger and connecting with translated and thinking about the way about the right path.
This is another word, Agnes, knowing, because you have to maintain the movement of appropriation, but knowing, you have to force the word, because Agnes is something else, and it has to do with the event. Sorry.
so I was going to say, proceeding from this, that maybe you'll find it useful, or maybe not, to think about this, how Heidegger, from the very beginning, from 1919, the whole, well, not the whole point, but one of the things he's trying to do is to raise a methodological issue with the problem of beginning. How do we begin to phenomenologize or philosophize? Having accepted Nathor's criticism of Husserl, whereby Husserl, or the middle Husserl, would start with reflection, and the early Heidegger would say, or speak against reflectivity, and let's say in favor of a factical beginning. So he would say, for example, reflektieren wir doch nicht über das Anfangen, sondern fangen faktisch an. So indeed, we should not reflect on the beginning, but rather factically begin. And I think, so I am with Mahon on the continuity thesis. I think he's starting to think about all these issues from early on, and maybe we can think of Besinnung as a way to solve these methodological issues of how do we begin.
Totally agree. The second part of the quote is fundamental. This in the factician. We are already in the facticity, and I'll start from thinking too. So I totally agree. Yes, it's an epistemological and methodological issue.
Do we have any other questions? Mahon?
Not so much a question, but just to reply. There's a, when you were doing some questions on light and dark, and black and white, recently about it, it's very provocative, and I eventually found it. So it's in Heidegger's Freiburg. And he has this really interesting discussion of the importance of dark. The existence on light goes back to the operator, to the idea of constant light all the time. Anyway, I'll do it. I think it's nice.
I know what you're thinking. Look, I mean, I was thinking about that, and what is interesting is that how, it's not just sight or light, or but even sound and everything, all the senses seem to merge, and sort of this sort of like a fluidity that includes you. It's like everything is merging, flowing. So you can't really it's like synesthesia in a way. You can't really tell whether you're hearing things or seeing things or even touching things. It's like times you feel or you see the cave with your arms. Yeah.
Life wouldn't be like books.
Okay, so let us thank Clive Zammit and Francesca Brencio for their Brencio for
Thank you.
we will take a lunch break now. We're running 15 minutes late, but we will keep 1 hour break. So we will resume 15 minutes later after what the program says. That's the first comment. The second is some people are complaining about the sound. I will try to resolve it during the break. So thank you very much.